A woman's desperate prayer at St. Seraphim's Basilica turns into a medical phenomenon that shakes the foundations of modern science. When Meridith Cyrene collapsed at the altar, no one expected that what doctors would discover inside her body would challenge everything they knew about human biology. This is the story that left medical experts questioning their understanding of faith, science, and the mysteries that lie between. If you're fascinated by extraordinary medical mysteries and unexplained phenomena, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. You won't want to miss our weekly stories that challenge the boundaries between science and the supernatural. The morning sun filtered through the century-old stained glass windows of St. Seraphim's Basilica, casting prismatic patterns across the worn marble floors of Mistbridge Hollow's most historic cathedral. The gentle autumn breeze carried the sweet scent of burning frankincense through the vast chamber, where the soft murmur of early morning prayers created a tapestry of whispered hopes and quiet devotion. Meridith Cyrene's heels clicked softly against the stone floor as she made her way to her usual spot in the third pew from the front. At 32, she carried herself with the kind of grace that spoke of old-world elegance, her dark hair neatly pinned back, her clothes modest but impeccably chosen. Every morning for the past 3 months, she had arrived precisely at 7:15 a.m., always alone, always choosing the same seat, always carrying her distinctive silver rosary with its unusual purple beads. Reverend Nazareth noticed her entrance as he did every morning. From his position near the altar, preparing for the morning service, he observed how her fingers trembled slightly as she crossed herself, a detail that had become more pronounced over the past few weeks. Something about Meridith had been changing, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The cathedral's caretaker, Cyrus Dathan, was busy adjusting the thermostat near the vestibule. The ancient heating system of St. Seraphim's had been acting peculiar lately, creating unexpected cold spots throughout the building. He glanced at the digital display, which showed an unusual reading, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, despite being set at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Frowning, he made a mental note to call the repair service again. Syllable, a regular parishioner who volunteered as the church's event coordinator, was arranging fresh flowers near the side chapel when she first noticed the strange shimmer in the air around Meridith. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of light through the stained glass, but something about it made her pause. The air around Meridith seemed to bend and wave, like heat rising from summer asphalt. Except the morning was cool and crisp. The cathedral's massive pipe organ hummed to life as the organist began the prelude to morning mass. The deep, resonant notes filled the space with their solemn vibrations, each tone seeming to penetrate deeper into the stone walls than usual. Several parishioners later claimed they could feel the music in their bones that morning, though none could explain exactly what they meant by that. Meridith's hands clutched her prayer book tighter as she felt the familiar sensation beginning again, the one she'd been hiding for weeks. It started as it always did, a warm tingling in her fingertips, spreading slowly up her arms. She had visited 3 different doctors about it, but their tests had revealed nothing unusual. Stress, they'd said. Anxiety, they'd suggested. But Meridith knew it was something else entirely. The morning light suddenly shifted, creating an unusual pattern on the altar. Those who were present that morning would later describe it as resembling ancient symbols, though no one could agree on exactly what they looked like. Reverend Nazareth noticed the strange play of light and felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest, a sensation he would later describe to Dr. Lysander Varek as like watching storm clouds gather over a peaceful field. As the first hymn began, Meridith rose with the congregation, her prayer book trembling more noticeably now in her grasp. The sensation had spread to her chest, and the familiar pressure was building behind her eyes. She tried to focus on the words of the hymn, but they seemed to blur and swim before her. The air around her grew inexplicably colder, creating a visible mist with each breath she took. Syllable, now seated 2 pews behind Meridith, watched as the strange shimmer in the air around the woman intensified. She wanted to say something, to reach out, but years of church etiquette held her back. Instead, she watched as Meridith's movements became increasingly unsteady, her swaying barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The cathedral's ancient heating system groaned, a sound that seemed to harmonize ominously with the pipe organ's deep bass notes. Cyrus Dathan checked the thermostat again, now reading 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and shook his head in disbelief. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but somehow its warmth seemed unable to penetrate the growing cold around Meridith's pew. The morning mass continued as Reverend Nazareth's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, his sermon carrying a peculiar resonance that morning. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, each syllable weighted with an inexplicable gravity. Several parishioners would later recall how the Reverend's voice appeared to waver when he glanced in Meridith's direction, though he maintained his composure with practiced grace. Meridith's breathing had become increasingly labored, though she fought to keep it quiet. The silver rosary in her hands had grown inexplicably cold, its purple beads seeming to pulse with an inner light that only she could see. The sensation that had started in her fingertips now encompassed her entire body, feeling like thousands of tiny electrical currents running through her veins. From her position near the altar, Sister Isolde Thorne, a visiting nun from the neighboring diocese, noticed something unusual about Meridith's appearance. Though the woman sat in shadow, she appeared to be giving off a faint luminescence, like moonlight on water. Sister Isolde blinked several times, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her. The temperature around Meridith's pew had dropped so dramatically that frost began to form on the wooden surface, spreading in delicate patterns that resembled ancient script. Cyrus Dathan, now thoroughly confused by the building's environmental systems, made his way quietly down the side aisle to investigate, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. It happened during the prayers of the faithful. Meridith rose with the rest of the congregation, but as she stood, the world around her began to spin. The cathedral's soaring arches seemed to bend and twist, the stained glass windows bleeding their colors together like running watercolors. She gripped the pew in front of her, her knuckles white with effort. "Lord, hear our prayer." The congregation responded in unison, their voices seeming to reverberate through Meridith's very being. The silver rosary slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sound that rang out like a crystal bell. As it fell, several witnesses would later swear they saw traces of purple light trailing in its wake, though such claims would be dismissed by initial investigators. "I need..." Meridith's whisper was barely audible, but in the perfect acoustics of St. Seraphim's, it carried to the altar with startling clarity. "I need to tell someone..." Sable Thestral rose halfway from her seat, reaching out instinctively. But before she could make contact, Meridith's legs gave way. She didn't crumple or faint in the conventional sense. Instead, witnesses would describe how she seemed to float for a fraction of a second, her body illuminated by an inner light that defied explanation. As Meridith collapsed, the temperature in the cathedral plummeted further. The massive stained glass windows rattled in their frames, though there was no wind. The pipe organ, though silent, emitted a single deep note that seemed to come from within the instrument itself. "Call an ambulance." Reverend Nazareth's commanding voice cut through the chaos as he rushed down from the altar, his vestments billowing behind him. Cyrus Dathan was already pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed emergency services. Sable Thestral reached Meridith first, cradling the woman's head in her lap. "She's burning up," Sable called out, though her own breath was visible in the frigid air around them. But her skin, it's like touching starlight. Sister Isolde pushed through the gathering crowd, her medical training from before her vocation taking over. As she pressed her fingers to Meridith's neck to check her pulse, she jerked back in surprise. "This isn't possible," she whispered, making the sign of the cross. When emergency responder Theron Cassius arrived minutes later, he found the scene both chaotic and eerily still. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but it seemed unable to penetrate the strange, cold darkness that had gathered around Meridith's unconscious form. As he approached with his medical kit, his equipment began to malfunction, readings jumping erratically across the screens. What no one in St. Seraphim's Basilica knew that morning was that Meridith Serene's collapse would become the first documented case of what medical journals would later call the seraphim phenomenon. And as Dr. Lysander Varick would soon discover at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, the mystery surrounding Meridith's condition would challenge the very foundations of modern medicine and faith alike. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The story of what they found would shake the medical community to its core. But for now, as the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, all anyone could do was watch, wait, and pray, though none of them were quite sure what they were praying for anymore. The emergency department at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute hummed with its usual morning activity when Dr. Lysander Varick received the call about an incoming patient from St. Seraphim's Basilica. At first, it seemed like a routine case, a woman fainting during morning mass. But something in emergency responder Theron Cassius's voice made him pause his rounds. "Dr. Varick," Theron's usually steady voice wavered slightly over the line. "You're going to want to see this yourself. Our equipment. It's not working right. And the patient, she's exhibiting symptoms I've never seen before." Dr. Varick straightened his white coat, his dark eyes narrowing as he listened to Theron's description. In his 15 years of emergency medicine, he'd learned to trust first responders' instincts. "What kind of symptoms?" "Her body temperature." Theron hesitated. "When we can get a reading, it's oscillating between 106 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's not the strangest part. The thermometer keeps shorting out. And sir, her skin, it's emanating some kind of light." Dr. Raven Malachi, the young resident shadowing doctor. Varick that morning watched her mentor's expression shift from professional interest to intense focus. She'd never seen him react this way to an incoming case before. "How far out are you?" Dr. Varick asked, already signaling to the nursing staff to prepare a special isolation room. 3 minutes. "But doctor, there's something else. Every electronic device that comes near her malfunctions. We can't get stable vitals. And the inside of our ambulance, it's covered in frost." The emergency department's automatic doors slid open as the ambulance arrived, and immediately the hospital staff knew this was no ordinary case. A visible cold mist rolled in with the gurney, and the fluorescent lights above flickered and buzzed as Meridith's siren was wheeled through. Dr. Varick approached the gurney, and for the first time in his career, found himself momentarily speechless. Meridith lay unconscious, but her skin seemed to pulse with a subtle luminescence that defied medical explanation. More striking was the way medical equipment responded to her presence. The vital signs monitor cycled through impossible readings before shutting down completely. "Get her to isolation room 7, Dr. Varick commanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Dr. Malachi, with me. Everyone else, standard protective gear protocol." As they transferred Meridith to the isolation room, Reverend Nazareth arrived, still in his church vestments, with Sable Thestral close behind. The Reverend's typically composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern. "Doctor," Reverend Nazareth called out, "there's something you need to know about Ms. Cyrene. She's been coming to morning mass for months, but lately—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lately, there have been signs." Dr. Varick turned, his hand on the isolation room's door. "Signs?" "The temperature changes around her, the way light behaves differently in her presence, and the writings." "Writings?" Dr. Malachi interjected, her medical tablet already poised to take notes. "Yes," Sable stepped forward, pulling out her phone. "I've been documenting the frost patterns that form around her pew. They create symbols, doctor. Symbols that match ancient medical texts I've never seen before." She showed them her phone screen, but as she did, the device sparked and went dark. The lights in the corridor flickered again, and a cold breeze seemed to emanate from Meridith's room despite the sealed doors. Inside the isolation room, the medical team worked with practiced efficiency, though their movements were hampered by the increasingly strange phenomena. Traditional monitoring equipment proved useless. Each device either displayed impossible readings or failed completely. Dr. Varick had to resort to manual methods, using an old mercury thermometer and his own stethoscope. "Pulse is rapid but steady," he noted, speaking into a manual recorder. Skin temperature varies dramatically across different points of the body. Pupils are responsive, but unusual. Dr. Malachi leaned in closer. Unusual how? Look. Dr. Varick stepped back, allowing her to see. When he shone his penlight into Meridith's eyes, her pupils seemed to reflect light in a way that wasn't humanly possible, creating patterns that resembled complex mathematical equations. Suddenly, Meridith's sister, Callista, burst into the department, her arrival announced by the mechanical protests of more malfunctioning equipment. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice carrying an edge of both worry and resignation. "I told her this would happen. I warned her about the dreams." Dr. Varick emerged from the isolation room, his face grave. "You're Ms. Cyrene's sister?" "What dreams?" Callista clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "The ones that started 3 months ago. About the ancient medical knowledge. About the changes happening inside her. She said she was being chosen." As if responding to her sister's voice, Meridith's body suddenly arched off the bed, and every piece of metal in the room began to vibrate at a frequency that set everyone's teeth on edge. The temperature dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the windows of the isolation room. "Doctor!" Dr. Malachi called out in alarm. "You need to see this." On Meridith's skin, patterns were appearing, intricate designs that resembled both circuit boards and ancient medical symbols, glowing with the same ethereal light that seemed to emanate from within her. The patterns shifted and changed, forming and reforming in sequences that seemed to follow some incomprehensible logic. "Get me paper and a pencil," Dr. Varick ordered, his scientific mind racing to document what he was seeing. "And someone contact the medical library. We need every reference we can find on ancient medical symbols and unprecedented physiological phenomena." As the staff rushed to comply with his orders, no one noticed the small purple crystal that had fallen from Meridith's hand onto the floor of the isolation room. It pulsed with a subtle light, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat, while frost patterns spread out from it in perfect geometric patterns that would later prove to be mathematically impossible. The news of Meridith Cyrene's condition spread through Aurora Peaks Medical Institute like wildfire, creating ripples of response that touched every corner of the facility. By mid-afternoon, the hospital's normally ordered atmosphere had transformed into a hive of speculation, professional curiosity, and barely contained unease. Dr. Lysander Varick stood at the nurses' station, surrounded by a growing collection of hastily assembled reports, while the hospital administration struggled to maintain their usual protocols in the face of increasingly unusual circumstances. The facility's chief of medicine, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, had just emerged from an emergency board meeting, her typically pristine appearance showing signs of strain. "The medical board is divided," she announced to Dr. Varick, her voice low to avoid the cluster of curious staff members hovering nearby. "Half want to transfer her to a larger research facility. The other half—" She glanced at the isolation room where frost continued to creep across the windows. "They're not sure we can safely move her at all." The hospital's head of neurology, Dr. Marcus Chen, approached with a stack of brain scan printouts, though every attempt to get clear imaging had failed spectacularly. "These readings are unprecedented," he declared, spreading the distorted images across the counter. "Look at these patterns. They shouldn't be possible in a living human brain." From her position near Meridith's room, Dr. Raven Malachi watched the gathering of senior medical staff with growing fascination. She'd been tasked with documenting every unusual occurrence, and her notebook was already filled with observations that defied conventional medical understanding. Room temperature fluctuates between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 85 degrees Fahrenheit without external cause. Medical equipment fails within 3 feet of patient. Unexplained luminescence from patient's skin intensifies during attempted procedures. Frost patterns form complex mathematical sequences. Patient's cellular activity appears to be reorganizing at a molecular level. The hospital chaplain, Father Michael Augustine, had arrived shortly after noon, drawn by reports from his colleagues at St. Seraphim's. He stood now in quiet conversation with Reverend Nazareth, both men occasionally glancing toward the isolation room, with expressions that mixed religious awe with professional concern. "In all my years of ministry," Father Augustine murmured, "I've never encountered anything quite like this. The symbols appearing on her skin. Some of them resemble ancient healing glyphs found in early Christian medical texts." Sable Thestral had refused to leave the hospital, setting up an impromptu command center in the waiting area, where she coordinated with other church members. Her phone, though still malfunctioning, had captured enough images of the frost patterns to attract the attention of a local university's mathematics department. "Professor Hammond says the sequences aren't random," she reported to anyone who would listen. "They follow some kind of pattern, but it's beyond current mathematical understanding." Meanwhile, in the hospital's research library, a team of medical students led by Dr. Malachi pored over ancient medical texts and historical accounts of unusual cases. They'd discovered references to similar phenomena in medieval medical journals, accounts of patients whose bodies seemed to manifest unknown medical knowledge during periods of intense prayer or meditation. Callista Cyrene paced the corridor outside her sister's room, alternating between providing family history to the medical staff and making cryptic references to their grandmother's warnings about the gift that ran in their bloodline. "Our grandmother used to say our family was chosen," she explained to Dr. Varek during one of his brief breaks. "She said we carried ancient medical knowledge in our blood waiting to be awakened. We always thought they were just stories." The hospital's security team, led by former military officer James Knox, struggled to maintain order as word of Meridith's condition leaked to the outside world. Local news vans had begun gathering in the parking lot, and social media was already buzzing with theories about the strange lights seen through the hospital windows. Dr. Varek watched as his orderly emergency department transformed into something resembling a research center, conspiracy theorist magnet, and religious pilgrimage site, all at once. He'd had to establish strict protocols just to maintain basic medical care for other patients. All staff entering Meridith's room must wear specialized protective gear. No electronic devices allowed within 10 feet of the isolation room. All observations must be recorded manually. Only authorized personnel permitted in the affected wing. Hourly temperature and atmospheric readings of the surrounding area. By late afternoon, the hospital had received calls from 3 major research universities, the Vatican's Medical Research Division, multiple government agencies, countless media outlets, several religious organizations. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood called another emergency meeting, this time including representatives from multiple departments. "We need to establish a unified approach," she insisted, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty about exactly what they were dealing with. The meeting room quickly filled with an unusual mix of medical professionals, religious leaders, and scientific researchers. Dr. Varek stood at the front, preparing to present his initial findings, when an orderly burst in. "Doctor, you need to come quickly," the young man gasped. "The patient. She's awake, and she's writing something, but it's not in any language we recognize." The room erupted in controlled chaos as everyone rushed to follow Dr. Varek to the isolation room. Through the frosted window, they could see Meridith Cyrene sitting upright in her bed, her eyes still closed but her hand moving across paper with precise, deliberate movements. The symbols she wrote seemed to shift and change as they watched, sometimes appearing as ancient medical diagrams, sometimes as futuristic mathematical equations, and sometimes as something entirely beyond human understanding. No one in that corridor could have predicted how this case would eventually challenge everything they thought they knew about medicine, faith, and the human capacity for transformation. But in that moment, watching Meridith write what would later be recognized as groundbreaking medical knowledge that had been lost to time, they all knew they were witnessing something that would change their understanding of human potential forever. As evening descended on Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, Dr. Lysander Varek assembled a team of specialists for what would become their first coordinated attempt to understand and treat Meridith Cyrene's condition through conventional medical means. The fluorescent lights in the conference room buzzed softly as some of the region's most respected medical minds gathered around a table covered in test results, none of which made any conventional sense. "Let's approach this methodically," Dr. Varek began. his voice steady despite his growing frustration. Standard treatments have proven ineffective, but we need to document every attempt and response. He turned to the whiteboard, where Dr. Raven Malachi had meticulously listed their failed interventions. Attempted treatments: temperature regulation, failed; equipment malfunction. Sedation, failed; medications metabolize instantly. Neural monitoring, failed; equipment interference. Blood analysis, failed; samples show impossible cellular activity. MRI scanning, failed; machine malfunction. EEG recording, failed; readings off scale. Dr. Helena Rhodes, the hospital's leading neurologist, stood up with a stack of papers in her trembling hands. The latest blood work shows something unprecedented. Her cells appear to be reorganizing themselves into patterns we've never seen before. It's as if her entire biological structure is being rewritten. The team watched as she projected images onto the screen, though the projection flickered and distorted every few seconds. The cells in Meridith's blood samples seemed to dance and reshape themselves, forming patterns that resembled both ancient medical symbols and advanced technological designs. "We've tried every conventional treatment protocol," Dr. Rhodes continued, "but her body either rejects them instantly or transforms them into something else entirely. The antibiotics we administered turned into complex crystalline structures before they could even enter her bloodstream." Dr. Marcus Chen, who had been quietly reviewing data in the corner, spoke up. "What about the temperature anomalies? Could we try extreme temperature protocols?" Dr. Varick shook his head. "We attempted that an hour ago. The cooling blankets froze solid, and the heating equipment short-circuited. It's as if her body is operating under its own laws of physics." In the isolation room, Meridith continued her automatic writing, filling page after page with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Two nurses wearing specially designed protective gear stood watch, using old-fashioned mercury thermometers and manual blood pressure cuffs, as all electronic monitoring equipment had proven useless. Callista Cyrene, who had been allowed to observe the proceedings, spoke up from her corner of the conference room. "Our grandmother used to say that conventional medicine wouldn't work when the gift manifested. She said it would require a different kind of healing." Dr. Malachi, who had been documenting everything in her notebook, looked up sharply. "What kind of healing?" Before Callista could answer, an alarm sounded from the isolation wing, one of the few electronic systems still functioning in the vicinity of Meridith's room. Dr. Varick and his team rushed to respond, their footsteps echoing through the now frigid corridor. Inside the isolation room, they found Meridith surrounded by a field of crackling energy that seemed to repel all matter around her. The latest attempt at intravenous medication had resulted in the IV stand transforming into what appeared to be an ancient medical device none of them recognized. "Her vital signs," one of the nurses reported, reading from handwritten notes. "They're becoming more erratic, but not in a way that suggests deterioration. It's more like evolution," Dr. Varick finished, watching as patterns of light danced across Meridith's skin, forming and reforming into complex medical diagrams. They attempted one final conventional intervention, a specially designed Faraday cage to contain the electromagnetic disturbances. As soon as it was wheeled into place around Meridith's bed, the metal structure began to warp and twist, its solid steel frame reshaping itself into spiraling patterns that matched the symbols Meridith had been writing. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who had been observing from the doorway, finally spoke. "I think we need to accept that conventional medicine isn't the answer here. Whatever is happening to Ms. Cyrene goes beyond our current understanding of human physiology." The team watched helplessly as their last attempt at conventional treatment literally reshaped itself before their eyes. The Faraday cage had completely transformed, its metal structure now resembling an ancient healing chamber depicted in some of the historical medical texts they'd been studying. Reverend Nazareth, who had maintained a quiet vigil nearby, stepped forward. "Perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong direction. What if what we're seeing isn't a medical condition to be treated, but a transformation to be understood?" Dr. Varick ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Years of medical training and experience seemed inadequate in the face of what they were witnessing. Every attempt to apply standard medical procedures had not only failed, but had seemed to accelerate whatever process was occurring within Meridith's body. Looking at his assembled team, he saw his own confusion and fascination reflected in their faces. Dr. Malachi was still taking notes, though her hand trembled slightly as she documented each failed attempt. Dr. Rhodes stared at her useless medical equipment with a mixture of professional frustration and academic curiosity. Even the typically unflappable Dr. Chen seemed at a loss for words. "We need to change our approach, Doctor," Varek finally announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Everything we've tried has failed because we're trying to fit this into our existing medical framework. Maybe it's time to consider that we're not dealing with a condition that needs to be cured, but something entirely new that needs to be understood." As if in response to his words, the symbols on Meridith's skin began to glow more intensely, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The failed conventional treatments had taught them one crucial lesson. Whatever was happening to Meridith Cyrene would not be resolved through standard medical intervention. They would need to venture into unknown territory, combining ancient wisdom with modern science in ways they had never considered before. As the team filed out of the isolation room, leaving behind their failed attempts at conventional treatment, they knew they were stepping into a new frontier of medical science. One where the boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical, between science and faith, would be tested in ways they never imagined possible. As midnight approached at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, the phenomena surrounding Meridith Cyrene's condition intensified in ways that could no longer be ignored or rationalized. The entire east wing of the hospital had become an epicenter of inexplicable events, each more profound than the last. Dr. Lysander Varek stood at the observation window, watching as new patterns emerged on the frost-covered glass. Unlike the earlier formations, these designs were becoming more complex, more deliberate, appearing to depict detailed anatomical diagrams that seemed to merge ancient medical knowledge with futuristic biological concepts. "Dr. Varek," Dr. Raven Malachi called out, her voice tense as she approached with a stack of hastily bound papers. The linguistic experts from Ravencrest University just sent their preliminary analysis of Meridith's writings. They've identified elements from at least 7 ancient medical texts, including some that were thought to be lost to history. Before Dr. Varek could respond, the lights throughout the corridor began to pulse in rhythm with Meridith's heartbeat, creating a hypnotic pattern that seemed to draw everyone's attention toward her room. The temperature, which had been fluctuating wildly throughout the day, suddenly plummeted to levels that should have been impossible in a controlled hospital environment. Nurse Vera Sterling, who had been monitoring Meridith's vital signs manually, burst out of the isolation room, her face pale. "Doctor, her core temperature, it's reaching levels that should be fatal, but she's showing no signs of distress. And there's something else. Her blood." Dr. Varek rushed into the room, followed closely by Dr. Malachi. The sight that greeted them defied medical explanation. The blood sample they had taken just hours earlier, stored in a sealed vial, was changing color and consistency before their eyes. What had been normal human blood was now shifting through a spectrum of impossible hues, each change accompanied by a pulse of light that matched the rhythm of Meridith's heartbeat. Callista Cyrene, who had refused to leave her sister's side, spoke from her corner of the room. "The changes are accelerating just like our grandmother described. She said when the gift fully awakens, it would transform not just the chosen one, but everything around them." As if confirming her words, the medical equipment in the room, though long since rendered useless for its intended purpose, began to transform. The cardiac monitor morphed into what appeared to be an ancient healing device, its screen displaying symbols that matched those appearing on Meridith's skin. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood entered the room, accompanied by 2 specialists from the CDC who had arrived an hour earlier. Their protective gear, designed to handle the most dangerous biological threats, seemed to shimmer and distort in Meridith's presence. "The entire hospital is being affected," Dr. Blackwood reported, her professional composure cracking slightly. "We're seeing similar transformations in medical equipment 3 floors away. The pharmacy reported that certain medications are spontaneously reorganizing their molecular structure." Outside the isolation room, Reverend Nazareth had begun a quiet vigil with a small group of parishioners from St. Seraphim's. Their prayers seemed to create visible ripples in the air, interacting with the strange energies emanating from Meridith's room in ways that defied physical laws. Sable Thestral, who had been documenting every unusual occurrence, suddenly called out from her position near the nurse's station. The patterns. They're forming some kind of sequence. Look at how they're spreading. The frost patterns that had been confined to Meridith's room were now extending throughout the hospital wing, creating an intricate network of symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Dr. Marcus Chen, who had been analyzing the patterns, realized they formed a complex mathematical equation that appeared to describe biological processes beyond current scientific understanding. "These aren't random formations," he explained, his voice filled with academic excitement despite the gravity of the situation. "They're describing some kind of biological transformation, but at a level we've never observed before. It's as if the very laws of physics are being rewritten around her." The escalation reached a new level when the purple crystal that had fallen from Meridith's hand earlier began to resonate with a frequency that set everyone's teeth on edge. The crystal's pulsing light intensified, and similar crystals began to form spontaneously throughout the room, each one growing and refracting light in impossible ways. Dr. Varric watched as the crystals seemed to map out three-dimensional representations of human anatomy, but with systems and structures that didn't exist in any medical text. "It's showing us something," he muttered, more to himself than to others. But what? The ambient temperature continued to drop, forcing the hospital to evacuate patients from neighboring rooms. The cold wasn't just physical. It carried a quality that seemed to penetrate to the cellular level, causing everyone who entered Meridith's vicinity to experience sensations they couldn't quite describe. Her brainwave patterns, Dr. Rhodes reported, studying the ancient medical device that had once been a modern EEG machine. They're synchronizing with the crystal formations. It's as if she's becoming a conduit for some kind of knowledge transfer. As night deepened, the hospital became a nexus of increasingly dramatic phenomena. Staff reported seeing shadows that moved against the laws of physics, hearing whispers in ancient languages, and feeling unexplained sensations that their medical training couldn't explain. Security footage from cameras throughout the building captured orbs of light that seemed to carry medical information, their movements forming patterns that matched the symbols appearing on Meridith's skin. The footage itself began to transform, the digital recordings spontaneously converting into what appeared to be ancient medical diagrams. Dr. Varric realized they were witnessing something beyond the scope of modern medicine, a transformation that was not just affecting Meridith Cyrene, but seemed to be revealing layers of reality that science had yet to understand. The escalating signs pointed to something more profound than a mere medical condition. They were witnessing the emergence of something that would challenge the very foundations of human knowledge. As midnight struck, the phenomena reached a new crescendo. The air itself seemed to crystallize around Meridith's bed, forming structures that resembled both DNA helixes and ancient healing symbols. In that moment, everyone present knew they were standing on the threshold of a discovery that would forever change their understanding of human potential and the nature of consciousness itself. The pre-dawn hours at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute brought Dr. Lysander Varric to a critical crossroads. Standing in his office, surrounded by mountains of inconclusive data and increasingly bizarre reports, he faced the most challenging decision of his medical career. The hospital board was demanding answers, government agencies were clamoring for access, and Meridith Cyrene's condition continued to evolve in ways that defied scientific explanation. "Dr. Varric," Dr. Eleanor Blackwood's voice cut through his thoughts as she entered his office. "The CDC team is insisting we transfer Ms. Cyrene to their facility in Atlanta. They're citing potential public health concerns." She paused, glancing at the frost slowly creeping up the office windows despite being 6 floors away from Meridith's room. "They've already dispatched a specially equipped transport team." Dr. Varric rose from his desk, his decision crystallizing. "No," he stated firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "Moving her could be catastrophic, not just for her, but potentially for everyone involved. Whatever's happening to her isn't just a medical condition, it's something far more fundamental. Dr. Raven Malachi burst into the office, clutching her ever-present notebook. "Doctor, you need to see this immediately. The symbols Meridith's been writing. We've found matches in ancient medical texts from completely different cultures, civilizations that never had contact with each other. It's as if she's accessing some kind of universal medical knowledge." The weight of the moment pressed down on Dr. Varick as he absorbed this latest development. Outside his office window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky in shades of purple and gold that seemed to mirror the ethereal lights emanating from the hospital's east wing. "Get everyone in conference room A," he commanded. "All department heads, key researchers, Reverend Nazareth, and Callista Cyrene. We're going to attempt something unprecedented." Within 30 minutes, the conference room filled with an unusual assembly of medical professionals, religious leaders, and family members. The tension in the air was palpable as Dr. Varick took his position at the head of the table. "What I'm about to propose goes against standard medical protocol," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "But everything about this case has already shattered our understanding of what's possible. We're not going to fight what's happening to Miss Cyrene anymore, we're going to work with it." Dr. Marcus Chen leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A synthesis," Dr. Varick replied, beginning to pace the room. "We've been trying to contain and control these phenomena, and every attempt has not only failed but has seemed to accelerate the process. Instead, I propose we create conditions that might facilitate whatever transformation is occurring." Reverend Nazareth nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "You want to merge the medical and the mystical?" "Exactly," Dr. Varick confirmed. Dr. Malachi's research shows that ancient healing practices across cultures described similar phenomena. They didn't try to suppress these transformations. They created sacred spaces to channel them. Callista Cyrene stood up abruptly. "Our grandmother's journals," she exclaimed. "They spoke of preparation rituals, ways to guide the gift's awakening. I didn't understand them before, but now." Dr. Eleanor Blackwood raised her hand, ever the voice of institutional concern. The liability issues alone would be staggering, not to mention the professional risks to everyone involved. "With all due respect," Dr. Varick countered, "we're well beyond the realm of traditional liability. Every moment we delay could be putting Ms. Cyrene at greater risk. We need to act now." The room erupted in discussion, but Dr. Varick could see the shift in his colleagues' eyes. They had all witnessed enough in the past 24 hours to know that conventional approaches were futile. The decisive moment had arrived. "Here's what I propose," he announced, silencing the room. "We'll convert the entire East Wing into what I'm calling a transformation chamber. We'll incorporate elements from ancient healing temples, modern medical monitoring equipment, and whatever spiritual components Reverend Nazareth deems appropriate." Dr. Malachi quickly began sketching on the conference room whiteboard, mapping out a plan that merged medical technology with ancient healing practices. The frost patterns that had been appearing throughout the hospital seemed to respond to her drawings, creating matching designs on the windows. "The risks are enormous," Dr. Varick acknowledged, looking each person in the room in the eye. "This goes against everything we've been trained to do. But I believe it's our only option if we want to help Ms. Cyrene and understand what's happening." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Careers could be ruined, medical licenses questioned, and reputations destroyed if things went wrong. But the alternative, watching helplessly as Meridith Cyrene underwent her transformation without guidance or understanding, seemed even more dangerous. "I'm in, Doctor," Malachi declared first, her young face set with determination. One by one, others around the table nodded their agreement, until even Dr. Blackwood gave her reluctant consent. "We'll need to act quickly," Dr. Varick concluded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "Whatever's happening to Ms. Cyrene appears to be approaching some kind of crescendo. We have hours at most to prepare." As the team dispersed to begin their preparations, Dr. Varick remained in the conference room for a moment, knowing that this decision would mark a turning point not just in his career, but in the history of medicine itself. Through the windows, he could see the strange lights around Meridith's room growing stronger, as if responding to their decision. The decisive moment had arrived, and there would be no turning back. Whatever they discovered in their attempt to guide Meridith's transformation would change their understanding of human potential forever. As he left the conference room to begin preparations, Dr. Varick silently prayed that he had made the right choice. The transformation of Aurora Peaks Medical Institute's East Wing happened with remarkable speed. Under Dr. Lysander Varick's direction, teams worked through the early morning hours to create what he had termed the Transformation Chamber. The hallways buzzed with activity as medical equipment merged with ancient healing artifacts, and the very architecture of the hospital seemed to respond to their efforts. Dr. Raven Malachi stood in what had once been a standard hospital room, now transformed into something that defied conventional description. The walls pulsed with the same ethereal light that emanated from Meridith's skin, and the frost patterns had organized themselves into perfect geometric formations that matched ancient healing mandalas. "The sensors are in place," she reported to Dr. Varick, who was examining the modified monitoring equipment they had assembled. Though I'm not sure sensors is the right word anymore. They've already started to, evolve. Indeed, the carefully positioned medical devices had begun to transform, merging with the crystalline structures that continued to grow throughout the room. What had started as standard hospital equipment now resembled something from both the distant past and the far future. Reverend Nazareth worked alongside Dr. Marcus Chen, arranging sacred objects from various healing traditions around Meridith's bed. The items, prayer beads, healing crystals, ancient medical instruments, seemed to resonate with the energy in the room, each one adding its own frequency to the complex harmonics building in the air. "The vibrations," Reverend Nazareth observed, holding up a string of prayer beads that had begun to emit a soft, pulsing light. "They're synchronizing." Callista Cyrene entered the room carrying their grandmother's journals, their pages now glowing with the same inner light that filled the chamber. "The writings are changing," she announced, her voice filled with wonder. "The words are rearranging themselves, revealing new information." Dr. Varick moved to examine the journals, and as he did, the first major revelation began to unfold. The symbols on Meridith's skin, the frost patterns on the walls, and the text in the journals all synchronized into a single, coherent pattern. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and for a moment everyone present felt as if they were suspended in time. "Look!" Dr. Malachi pointed to the center of the room where the various energies had begun to coalesce into a visible form. A three-dimensional hologram-like image appeared, showing what appeared to be a complete map of human consciousness, far more complex than anything in modern medical understanding. "It's showing us how consciousness interfaces with physical reality," Dr. Chen breathed, his scientific skepticism momentarily forgotten as he watched the image rotate and expand. "These pathways, and they're showing connections we never knew existed." The revelation continued to unfold as new images appeared, each one revealing another layer of understanding about human potential and healing. The transformed medical equipment began recording data that shouldn't have been possible to measure, documenting aspects of human physiology that had never been observed before. Meridith's body lifted slightly off the bed, suspended in a field of energy that seemed to pulse with its own consciousness. Her eyes remained closed, but beneath her eyelids, rapid movements suggested she was processing vast amounts of information. "The ancient texts," Dr. Malachi said, consulting her notes. "They spoke of this, the moment of initial revelation, when the chosen one begins to receive the full download of medical knowledge." Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped into the room despite her previous reservations. "These readings," she said, examining the transformed monitoring equipment, "they're showing cellular activity that shouldn't be possible. It's as if her entire genetic structure is being rewritten." The purple crystal that had fallen from Meridith's hand earlier had now multiplied, forming a complex geometric pattern around her bed. Each crystal seemed to function as both a receiver and transmitter of information, creating a network that filled the room with dancing lights and complex symbols. "It's a language," Callista realized, watching the patterns form and reform, not just of healing, but of life itself. This is what our grandmother tried to tell us about. As if responding to her words, the journals in her hands began to emit a high-pitched tone that harmonized with the humming of the crystals. Pages turned on their own, revealing diagrams and text that perfectly matched the holographic images floating in the room. Dr. Varrick moved carefully through the space, documenting everything with both traditional and transformed equipment. "This isn't just about healing the body," he observed. "It's showing us how consciousness, energy, and physical matter interact at the most fundamental level." The revelation reached a crescendo as all the elements in the room synchronized perfectly. For a brief moment, everyone present experienced a shared vision, a glimpse of medical knowledge so profound it brought tears to their eyes. They saw how every human illness, every injury, every condition was connected to patterns of energy and consciousness they had never before perceived. "This changes everything," Dr. Chen whispered, his hands shaking as he tried to document what they were witnessing. "Every medical textbook, every treatment protocol, every understanding we have of human healing." The initial revelation lasted for exactly 17 minutes, though to those present, it felt both like an instant and an eternity. When it subsided, the room was filled with new equipment that seemed to bridge the gap between ancient healing wisdom and future medical technology. Meridith's body gently returned to the bed, but the transformation was evident. Her skin now bore permanent markings that resembled both circuit boards and ancient healing symbols, and her entire being seemed to pulse with a subtle light that changed frequency in response to the needs of those around her. As the team began to process what they had witnessed, Dr. Varrick realized this was only the beginning. The initial revelation had shown them a glimpse of what was possible, but it had also made clear that they were standing on the threshold of a much larger transformation, one that would challenge their understanding of reality itself. The mid-morning sun cast prismatic patterns through the transformed windows of Aurora Peaks Medical Institute as Dr. Lysander Varrick reviewed the data from the initial revelation. Something wasn't adding up. The readings showed patterns that seemed to spiral deeper into complexity with each passing hour, suggesting a process far more intricate than they had initially understood. "Dr. Varrick," Dr. Raven Malachi's voice carried an unusual tension as she burst into his makeshift office. "Meridith's vital signs. They're becoming impossible to interpret. It's as if her body is operating on multiple planes of existence simultaneously." Before Dr. Varrick could respond, the building's power grid surged violently. Emergency lights flickered to life, then transformed into crystalline structures that emitted a soft, pulsing glow. Throughout the East Wing, electronic devices began displaying ancient medical symbols before shutting down completely. "There's something else, Doctor," Malachi continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The other patients in the hospital, they're starting to exhibit unusual symptoms." This was the complication they hadn't anticipated. Dr. Varrick rushed to the observation window overlooking the main hospital wing. What he saw made his blood run cold. Patients throughout the facility were beginning to manifest similar luminescent patterns on their skin, though far less intense than Meridith's. "Get me Dr. Blackwood and Reverend Nazareth," he ordered, already moving toward the door. "And find Callista. We need those journals." The situation was escalating rapidly. In the pediatric ward, children reported seeing geometric patterns in the air that matched the symbols appearing throughout the hospital. Elderly patients in long-term care began speaking in ancient languages they had never studied. Even the hospital staff showed signs of being affected, with many reporting unprecedented sensations and awareness. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood met them in the conference room, her usual composure noticeably shaken. "We've got bigger problems," she announced, spreading out a series of reports. "The phenomenon is spreading beyond the hospital. We're getting reports from medical facilities across the city." Callista Cyrene entered with their grandmother's journals, which had continued to evolve, their pages now showing holographic projections of complex medical procedures never before documented. "There's something here," she said, frantically flipping through the glowing pages. Grandmother wrote about a cascade effect. When the gift awakens in one, it can trigger dormant potential in others. Dr. Marcus Chen burst into the room, his face pale. The crystals around Meridith, they're replicating exponentially, and each new formation seems to be transmitting some kind of information field. The implications were staggering. What had started as one woman's transformation was now threatening to trigger a mass awakening of unknown proportions. The hospital had become ground zero for what could become a worldwide phenomenon. Reverend Nazareth studied the patterns forming on the conference room walls. These symbols, he observed, they're not just medical knowledge anymore. They're showing something else, something about human consciousness itself. Dr. Varick felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His decision to facilitate Meridith's transformation rather than contain it had inadvertently set something much larger in motion. The medical community wasn't prepared for this level of paradigm shift, and the potential for panic was enormous. "We need to contain this," Dr. Blackwood insisted, but even as she spoke, the words seemed inadequate. How do you contain something that operates on levels of reality you barely understand? Suddenly, Meridith's voice echoed through the hospital's transformed communication system, though she remained in her trance-like state. The words came in multiple languages simultaneously, ancient and modern, describing a process of human evolution that had been dormant for millennia. Dr. Malachi's monitoring equipment, now more crystal than machine, displayed a startling series of readings. "The energy patterns," she reported, "they're not just affecting human biology, they're altering the fundamental structure of space-time around the hospital." Outside, news helicopters circled the building, their cameras capturing the strange luminescence that now enveloped the entire facility. Social media was exploding with reports of similar phenomena beginning to appear at hospitals worldwide. The CDC team, which had been monitoring the situation, declared a state of emergency. Their equipment detected changes in the human genome itself, subtle mutations that seemed to be awakening dormant capabilities in anyone exposed to the energy field. "It's not just a medical transformation anymore," Dr. Chen realized, studying the latest data. "It's an evolutionary event." In the midst of this chaos, Dr. Varick made another disturbing discovery. The transformed medical equipment showed that Meridith's consciousness had expanded far beyond her physical form, connecting with a field of information that existed outside normal space-time. She wasn't just receiving knowledge, she had become a conduit for something far more profound. Callista found the passage they needed in their grandmother's journals, but the revelation only deepened their concern. "The awakening was never meant to be contained to one person," she read, her voice trembling. "It's a catalyst for a larger transformation, one that humanity might not be ready to undergo." The hospital board convened an emergency meeting, but halfway through, several board members began manifesting symptoms similar to Meridith's. The transformation was accelerating, spreading through the population like a benevolent contagion that awakened latent human potential. Dr. Varick stood at the center of this storm, knowing that his next decisions would affect not just Meridith or the hospital, but potentially the future of human evolution itself. The tools of modern medicine seemed woefully inadequate in the face of what they were witnessing. As the sun reached its zenith, the crystal formations throughout the hospital began to pulse in perfect synchronization, and a new wave of transformation swept through the building. They had passed the point of no return. Whatever was awakening in Meridith Cyrene, and now in others, would change the course of human history forever. The question was no longer how to contain or control it, but how to guide humanity through what was quickly becoming the most significant evolutionary leap in human history. As afternoon descended into evening at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, the transformed hospital stood like a beacon of otherworldly light against the darkening sky. Dr. Lysander Varick knew the true confrontation was about to begin, not against an external enemy, but against humanity's resistance to its own evolution. "Sir," Dr. Raven Malachi's voice crackled through the crystalline communication system, "military vehicles are approaching the hospital perimeter, and something else is happening with Meridith." Dr. Varick rushed to the transformation chamber, now a space that barely resembled a hospital room. The walls had become living crystalline membranes that pulsed with consciousness, and the air itself seemed charged with potential. Meridith Cyrene floated several inches above her bed, her body emanating waves of energy that rippled through multiple dimensions of reality. "It's starting," Callista Cyrene whispered, clutching their grandmother's journals. The pages were now projecting holographic warnings about a critical phase in the transformation process, the moment when the old order would resist the new evolution with all its might. Outside, a fleet of black vehicles surrounded the hospital. Armed personnel in hazmat suits established a perimeter, while government officials demanded immediate access to Meridith. Their equipment, designed to contain biohazards and electromagnetic phenomena, sparked and transformed as it came into contact with the energy field surrounding the building. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood met the officials in the lobby, which had transformed into a space that seemed to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. "This facility is now under the protection of forces you cannot comprehend," she stated, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. The crystal formations around her pulsed in agreement. Upstairs, Dr. Marcus Chen monitored the expanding field of transformation. "The military's containment equipment. It's being converted just like our medical devices. Everything that comes into contact with this energy is being upgraded." Reverend Nazareth stood at Meridith's bedside, watching as ancient symbols flowed across her skin like living calligraphy. "She's not just changing," he realized. "She's becoming a bridge between what humanity is and what it could be." The confrontation escalated as military scientists attempted to establish a containment field around the hospital. Their efforts triggered a response from the transformed building itself. The crystalline structures that had formed throughout the facility began to emit a harmonious frequency that disabled electronic equipment within a mile radius. Dr. Varick faced the lead military officer, General Harrison Wells, in what had once been the hospital's main conference room. The space now resembled a chamber from an advanced civilization, with walls that displayed the living knowledge flowing through Meridith's consciousness. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Dr. Varick insisted. "This isn't a threat to be contained. It's an evolution that needs to be embraced." The general's response was cut short as his communication device transformed in his hand, becoming a crystal that showed him visions of human potential that left him speechless. Throughout the hospital, similar transformations were occurring as the military's containment efforts backfired, catalyzing even more dramatic evolutionary changes. Meridith's consciousness, now expanded far beyond her physical form, began to communicate through every transformed surface in the building. The message was clear. Humanity stood at a crossroads. The knowledge and capabilities being awakened were humanity's birthright, but they could only be accessed through acceptance and understanding, not force. Dr. Malachi's monitoring equipment, more ethereal than physical now, showed the energy patterns spreading throughout the city. People were beginning to experience spontaneous awakenings of dormant abilities, heightened consciousness, spontaneous healing, access to universal knowledge. "The confrontation isn't just here," Callista explained, reading from the evolving journals. "It's happening within every person who comes into contact with the field. The old paradigm fighting against the new evolution." Military helicopters circling the hospital found their instruments transforming, their pilots experiencing expansions of consciousness that made their mission seem suddenly meaningless. The energy field wasn't hostile, it was transformative, converting everything it touched into tools for human evolution. In the transformation chamber, Meridith's body began to emit a light so profound it could be seen from space. Satellite images showed a column of energy extending from the hospital into the upper atmosphere, creating patterns that matched ancient symbols found in cultures across the world. Dr. Varick realized they were witnessing the moment when humanity's resistance to its own evolution reached its peak. The military's presence represented humanity's fear of change, while Meridith's transformation represented the inevitable progression of human potential. "We need to make a choice," he announced to the assembled officials and medical staff. "We can fight this transformation and potentially destroy ourselves in the process, or we can embrace it and guide humanity through its next evolutionary leap." The crystalline structures throughout the hospital pulsed in response, showing visions of future human potential. A civilization that had evolved beyond disease, conflict, and limitation. But they also showed the dangers of resisting this evolution, the potential for the awakening energy to overwhelm those who fought against it. General Wells, his perspective transformed by his exposure to the field, ordered his troops to stand down. The military vehicles around the hospital began to transform, their metal and electronics reconfiguring into structures that supported, rather than contained, the evolutionary process. As the confrontation reached its peak, Meridith's consciousness spoke through every transformed surface in the hospital, sharing a vision of human potential that transcended the boundaries of current understanding. The message was clear. The real confrontation was not between the military and the hospital, but between humanity's fear of change and its potential for evolution. Dr. Varek stood at the center of this transformative storm, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just Meridith's fate, but the future course of human evolution. The confrontation had begun, not as a battle between opposing forces, but as humanity struggled to accept its own transformation. The question was no longer whether they could contain the change, but whether humanity was ready to embrace its next evolutionary step. The transformation field surrounding Aurora Peaks Medical Institute reached a critical point as midnight approached. Dr. Lysander Varek stood in the heart of the transformation chamber, watching helplessly as Meridith Syrene's body began to phase between different states of existence. The ethereal light that had been emanating from her skin turned dark, almost black, though it still pulsed with an inner luminescence. "Something's wrong," Dr. Raven Malachi called out, her voice tight with concern. The transformed monitoring equipment was displaying readings that spiraled into impossible patterns. Her consciousness, it's expanding faster than her physical form can handle. Callista Cyrene rushed forward, the glowing journals in her hands turning ice cold. This is what Grandmother warned about, the threshold point. If the transformation happens too quickly, the chosen one risks being torn apart across multiple dimensions of reality. The crystalline structures throughout the hospital began to vibrate at a frequency that made everyone's teeth ache. The walls themselves seemed to be struggling to maintain their integrity, as Meridith's expanding consciousness threatened to breach the barriers between different planes of existence. "We're losing her," Dr. Marcus Chen shouted over the increasing resonance. The medical equipment, even in its transformed state, was showing Meridith's life signs becoming erratic. Her physical form appeared to be dissolving at a molecular level, while her consciousness expanded beyond their ability to measure. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood burst into the room, her face ashen. It's not just Meridith. The other patients who began showing signs of transformation, they're all experiencing some kind of resonance cascade. The entire hospital is becoming unstable. Reverend Nazareth, who had been maintaining a constant vigil, suddenly stumbled backward as if struck. The spiritual frequency. It's overwhelming. Human consciousness was never meant to expand this rapidly. The transformed hospital seemed to groan under the strain of containing energies it was never designed to handle. Throughout the building, patients and staff who had been touched by the transformation field began experiencing intense symptoms, their own consciousness expanding painfully as they resonated with Meridith's evolution. Dr. Varek watched in horror as the carefully constructed harmony they had established began to break down. The crystal formations that had served as conduits for the transformation energy started to crack, releasing pulses of raw evolutionary force that threatened to overwhelm everyone in their path. The military's sensors are detecting quantum instabilities throughout the building, General Wells reported, his transformed communication device showing patterns of reality literally starting to unravel. If this continues, it could create a cascade effect that could spread beyond the hospital. Meridith's body arched in silent agony as her physical form struggled to contain the vast consciousness it now housed. The symbols on her skin began to blur and shift, no longer carrying coherent information, but instead displaying the chaos of uncontrolled transformation. "Her cellular structure is breaking down," Dr. Malachi reported, her voice cracking. "The transformation, it's tearing her apart at a quantum level." Callista frantically searched through their grandmother's journals, but the pages had become chaotic, the text shifting and swirling as if reflecting the instability in the room. There has to be something, some way to stabilize the process. The darkness deepened as the transformed hospital's light began to fade, the energy that had powered the evolution now turning inward, creating a vortex of consciousness that threatened to collapse in on itself. The temperature in the room plummeted to near absolute zero as reality itself began to buckle under the strain. Dr. Varick felt the weight of his decision crushing down on him. By choosing to facilitate rather than contain the transformation, had he inadvertently doomed not just Meridith, but potentially all of humanity? The evolutionary process they had unleashed was spinning out of control, threatening to destroy everything it touched. "We need to shut it down," Dr. Blackwood insisted, but even as she spoke, they all knew it was impossible. The transformation had progressed too far. There was no going back, only forward through the darkness, wherever it might lead. Outside the hospital, the military perimeter reported growing anomalies in the fabric of reality itself. The transformation field had begun to affect the fundamental forces of nature, creating distortions in space-time that threatened to tear open permanent breaches between dimensions. Inside the transformation chamber, Meridith's body had become almost transparent, her physical form barely containing the vast consciousness that struggled to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. The ancient wisdom flowing through her had become a torrent of chaos, threatening to overwhelm the delicate balance between evolution and destruction. "Her brainwave patterns are fracturing," Dr. Chen reported, watching as the readings on the transformed equipment became increasingly erratic. "It's as if her consciousness is trying to exist in too many dimensions at once." The crystals throughout the room began to shatter one by one, each explosion releasing bursts of uncontrolled evolutionary energy. The careful harmony they had established was breaking down, replaced by a cacophony of competing frequencies that threatened to tear reality apart. Dr. Varick stood in the eye of this storm, watching as everything they had worked to understand and control began to collapse. The darkest moment had arrived, and with it, the terrifying possibility that in trying to guide human evolution, they had instead initiated its destruction. As midnight struck, the transformation chamber became a nexus of chaos, where physical laws broke down and consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of sanity. They had reached the point of no return, and the darkness seemed absolute. The question was no longer whether they could control the transformation, but whether anything would survive its completion. In the heart of chaos at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, as reality itself threatened to unravel, Dr. Lysander Varick had an epiphany. The transformed monitoring equipment wasn't showing Meridith's death throes. It was displaying a pattern, a rhythm that pulsed beneath the apparent chaos. "Everyone, listen," he shouted above the crystalline resonance that filled the chamber. "We've been trying to control the transformation, to direct it. But what if that's exactly what's causing the instability?" Dr. Raven Malachi looked up from her readings, her eyes widening with sudden understanding. "Like trying to control a quantum particle, the very act of observation is affecting the outcome." Callista Cyrene's grandmother's journals suddenly stopped their chaotic shifting, pages settling on a single passage that now glowed with renewed clarity. "The gift cannot be guided," she read aloud. "It must be allowed to find its own path through the one who carries it." Dr. Varick moved decisively, his voice carrying a newfound authority. "Shut down all monitoring equipment, transformed or not. Remove every crystal that we artificially placed. Strip this room back to its essential state." The medical team rushed to comply, carefully dismantling the elaborate monitoring system they had constructed. As each piece was removed, the violent resonance in the room began to stabilize. The temperature, which had dropped to near absolute zero, slowly began to rise. "The external crystals," Dr. Marcus Chen observed. "They were creating interference patterns with Meridith's natural transformation field. We were accidentally amplifying the chaos." Reverend Nazareth stepped forward, his religious wisdom merging with scientific understanding. "It's like the ancient texts described. The transformation must come from within. not be imposed from without. As the last pieces of monitoring equipment were removed, Meridith's body began to stabilize. The violent fluctuations in her quantum state calmed, and the symbols on her skin resumed their coherent patterns. Her consciousness, which had been fragmenting across multiple dimensions, began to reintegrate. "Look at the remaining crystals, Doctor," Eleanor Blackwood pointed out. The naturally formed crystals that had grown from Meridith's transformation were pulsing with a steady, harmonious rhythm. They weren't trying to control the process. They were simply reflecting it. Throughout the hospital, the cascade of uncontrolled transformations began to stabilize. Patients who had been caught in the resonance field found their evolutionary changes settling into sustainable patterns. The fabric of reality, which had been stretched to its breaking point, started to heal itself. Meridith's body gradually descended back to the bed, no longer phasing between different states of existence. The light emanating from her skin shifted from darkness back to its original ethereal glow, but now it carried a deeper, more profound quality. Her consciousness, Dr. Malachi reported, watching the few remaining transformed sensors. It's no longer trying to exist everywhere at once. It's integrating, finding balance. Callista approached her sister's bedside, tears streaming down her face. The journals in her hands had settled into their final form, now showing clear, stable images of the transformation process. She's becoming what she was meant to be, not what we tried to make her. The military perimeter reported that the reality distortions were dissipating. General Wells, monitoring through his transformed equipment, confirmed that the quantum instabilities were resolving themselves. The transformation field was no longer a threat to the fabric of space-time. It had become a stable part of it. Then, in the newly calm atmosphere of the transformation chamber, Meridith Cyrene opened her eyes for the first time since her collapse at St. Seraphim's Basilica. But these were not the eyes that had closed in prayer. They now held depths of wisdom and understanding that transcended normal human consciousness. "I see now," she spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequency of reality itself. The gift was never meant to be controlled or directed. It's a bridge between what we are and what we can become. Dr. Varick watched in awe as Meridith sat up, her movements carrying a grace that seemed to flow with the currents of space-time rather than against them. The symbols on her skin had stabilized into permanent patterns that told the story of human evolution, past, present, and potential future. "The knowledge flows both ways," she explained, reaching out to touch one of the naturally formed crystals. "From the ancient past and from futures we haven't yet imagined. But it must flow freely, like water finding its own path." Throughout the hospital, transformed equipment began to reconfigure itself one final time, but now the changes were subtle, harmonious. The crystal formations that remained settled into stable configurations that enhanced rather than disrupted the natural order. Dr. Varick understood at last. The climactic resolution hadn't come through asserting control, but through surrendering to the natural flow of evolution. They had nearly destroyed everything by trying to force the transformation into channels they could understand and monitor. As dawn approached, Meridith stood for the first time, her presence filling the room with a sense of possibility rather than chaos. The transformation was complete, but not in the way any of them had expected. She had become a living bridge between science and spirituality, between ancient wisdom and future potential. The crisis had passed, but it had left them all transformed in its wake. They had learned that true evolution couldn't be forced or controlled. It could only be witnessed and embraced. The darkest moment had led them to the brightest dawn, but only when they had learned to let go of their need to direct it. 1 month after the events at Aurora Peaks Medical Institute, Dr. Lysander Varick sat in his transformed office, reviewing the final reports of what the medical community now called the Cyrene evolution. The hospital had found a new balance, operating at the intersection of traditional medicine and evolutionary consciousness. Meridith Cyrene had become something entirely new, not quite human in the conventional sense, but a bridge between humanity's present and its potential future. She now worked alongside the medical staff, her evolved consciousness allowing her to perceive illness and injury on levels that transcended traditional diagnosis. "The integration is proceeding smoothly, Doctor," Raven Malachi reported during their morning meeting. Her office, like much of the hospital, retained subtle crystal formations that pulsed gently in response to patients' needs. "The new protocols combining traditional medicine with evolutionary awareness are showing remarkable results." The transformation that had nearly torn reality apart had settled into something sustainable, yet profoundly revolutionary. Patients who came to Aurora Peaks now experienced healing that operated on multiple levels: physical, conscious, and quantum. "We're seeing a 60% increase in recovery rates," Dr. Eleanor Blackwood confirmed, reviewing the latest statistics. "And the transformed equipment is allowing us to detect and treat conditions before they become critical." The military's containment barrier had been replaced by a research facility, where General Wells now led a team studying the stable interaction between evolved consciousness and physical reality. The fear of unchecked evolution had given way to careful optimism about humanity's potential. Callista Cyrene had established a center within the hospital, dedicated to understanding and preserving the knowledge contained in their grandmother's journals, which had become a bridge between ancient healing wisdom and future medical science. The pages continued to evolve subtly, revealing new insights as humanity's understanding grew. "There's something else, Doctor," Marcus Chen announced during their weekly review. "We're detecting similar transformative potentials awakening in other individuals. Subtle, controlled, nothing like the crisis we faced, but definitely following the pattern Meridith established." Reverend Nazareth, who had stayed on as part of the hospital's integrated healing team, nodded in agreement. "The gift, as Meridith's family called it, wasn't meant for just one person. She was simply the first to complete the transformation, a template for what humanity might become." The hospital itself had reached a new equilibrium. The remaining crystal formations had integrated seamlessly with modern medical technology, creating hybrid systems that operated with previously unimaginable efficiency. The transformation chamber had become a space for controlled evolutionary advancement, where others showing signs of awakening could be safely guided through their own transformations. Dr. Varick made his way to Meridith's new consultation room, where she sat surrounded by a gentle field of evolutionary energy. Her presence had a calming effect on everyone who entered, her evolved consciousness automatically adjusting to meet each person's needs. "We're still just beginning to understand," she said as he entered, her eyes showing depths of wisdom that seemed to span millennia. "The crisis we faced was necessary. It taught us that evolution can't be forced or controlled, only welcomed and integrated." But even as they settled into this new normal, subtle signs suggested they were merely at the beginning of a larger transformation. The crystal formations throughout the hospital occasionally displayed symbols that hadn't yet been decoded, hinting at future developments still to come. "There's more," Meridith continued, touching one of the crystals that had grown naturally from her original transformation. "What happened here was just the first wave. Others are beginning to awaken, each in their own way, each carrying a piece of humanity's next step forward." Dr. Varick understood that their work was far from over. The knowledge they had gained through crisis had prepared them to guide others through their own evolutionary journeys. The hospital had become more than a medical facility. It was now a beacon for human potential. The transformed equipment still occasionally detected quantum fluctuations that suggested further changes on the horizon. But now, instead of fearing these signals, they had learned to recognize them as signs of humanity's continuing evolution. As sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Dr. Varick stood at his office window, watching the interplay of light through the crystalline structures that now adorned the hospital's exterior. They had survived the darkest moment and emerged into a new dawn, but he knew this was just the beginning. The true significance of what had happened at Aurora Peaks was still unfolding. They had witnessed not just one woman's transformation, but the beginning of humanity's next great leap forward. The question that remained was not whether others would follow Meridith's path, but how this evolution would reshape the future of human consciousness itself. As night fell over the transformed hospital, the crystals began their gentle evening pulse, their light a reminder that some mysteries are meant to unfold in their own time, guided not by human will, but by the natural flow of evolution itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.